Hi, I am Sri from Shogini Systems. Today, let's look at Docker containers and see how we can split a large web application into manageable microservices running within Docker containers. What is a microservice? Microservice is a small subsystem independently executable within a container. For instance, in a web application, microservice could be the caching mechanism, it could be the execution mechanism like Ruby backend, Node backend, or PHP backend. It can be the database. So each of these should be able to run independently using TCP/IP. It can talk to the other service or the parent service if there is any. Microservice allows us to relocate these units within different hosting environments or virtual environments. And these units become extremely manageable. What is a Docker container? Major players are coming into Docker these days, including Google, Amazon, and even Microsoft. All practical purposes, you can treat a Docker container as a thin, super fast virtual machine. That is it, just like Vagrant. Let's not look at the complexities or what are the technical differences, but all practical purposes, a Docker container is just like a virtual machine, but it is essentially meant to run just one process. So you don't run MySQL, Apache, or Nginx, etc. within one container, though you can run, but it's not meant to be done so. So a Docker container is just like a thin, very fast virtual machine. You can launch a container within milliseconds. And another very important aspect of Docker container is it is very easy to configure. Just few lines of code. So the parent code comes from certified or good quality repository, and you just need to make few changes or few configuration to make it available to you. This also makes it very portable. You can run it on any server platform, be it cloud or be it locally hosted. Another thing is a complex and the entire infrastructure running Docker container is repeatable. Now let's look at the advantages of using a microservice, that too using Docker. It immensely simplifies DevOps. For example, if you are using Jenkins for your CI/CD pipeline, Jenkins can execute your application pulled from the Git repo within a container and destroy the container. So in a fraction of a second or within few seconds, a container can come up and your application can run and can be launched within the container and it can be taken away. So this gives huge potential for varied testing. For instance, you can test your application in CentOS, Ubuntu, or Debian, all these flavors just by running few Docker containers. You don't need to dedicate hardware for it. So this lowers costs. It also tremendously simplifies the infrastructure. So where do we start? How do we start? First, you need to look at a sample application. Take the application and see what are the major components. For instance, identify the caching mechanism and further split the caching mechanism into front-end caching, block level caching, sessions caching. Identify the database persistent areas. Identify the executional part, the engine that is executing your code. Identify the static content and the web server. You also need to identify the platforms and ports because these microservices will be using TCP/IP, basically TCP/IP to talk to each other on specified ports. You need to identify the ports and also the IP address through a certain mechanism so that these individual microservice or micro units can talk to each other. You also need to know the dependencies. For instance, when you launch your platform, you should know that certain things should be ready before certain services are activated. For instance, database service and the caching mechanisms should be ready before your web server comes up, etc. So that the user experience is not disturbed. Let's look at a sample use case where we see how we can split a complex PHP based very popular e-commerce platform called Magento 2 version 2, be it community edition or the enterprise edition, into separate Docker container. Here is a small animation. This block in the center is a fully working Magento implementation running on a dedicated server. The goal is to split this into separate Docker unit or microservices. You need to separate out the database part of the Magento into a separate container. This can be a container or it can be an Amazon RDS, etc. But you are splitting it. So database part goes away from your Magento box as a microservice running within a Docker container, for instance. Now, the caching mechanism, be it Memcache, be it Redis, separate it out into another Docker, one or multiple Docker containers. This could also be Amazon's Elastic Cache. Now, the front-end caching mechanism, Varnish, for instance, if you are using front-end caching, you can also split that up into a set of microservices running behind even a load balancer, so that the 90% of the users visiting your site hits these microservice units through a load balancer. Now comes the web server. Now Nginx web server, split it out again into Docker containers as microservices even behind a load balancer. Next is the execution part, PHP engine, be it PHP FPM. Now separate that out also into even a vertically scalable powerful Docker container. Now let's separate out the Magento source code into a set of Docker containers, and here the code that you developed or the extensions that you build on top of Magento and the Magento source repository both can be attached, and these volumes can be mapped so that CI/CD pipeline can be attached. So in a nutshell, this is how we split a Magento software into a set of microservices. At Shogini, we offer Docker and all related services. Should you have any questions, please feel free to contact. Bye bye. Thank you.